everyone, and welcome to the CMO Summit meeting. My name is Sandra, and I will be moderating today's call. Our speaker today is Katherine Black, Principal, KPMG, presenting Digital Disruption Update, Consumers on the Move. We will turn to the presentation in just a moment, but first I want to go over the web conference instructions. Everyone is currently in mute so that the background noise does not become distracting for the other participants. To view today's presentation as the screens change live, you may go to the link that was sent to you in your reminder email. Once in there, you may click anywhere on the page. Everyone see the pop-up with the option to make a comment? Feel free to ask questions by clicking on any slide, and we'll make sure all of your questions are answered. For the newer participants in the group, it might be useful to review some of the main benefits you can take advantage of as a member at no additional charge. First are the live monthly web conference meetings, which you've already dialed into today. I hope you find these useful, and we have an excellent lineup, which you can see by going to our website's schedule page. Second, we do record all of these, so if you are traveling or stuck in another meeting, simply log in at your leisure, and the full archives of past meetings are available to you with a number of interesting topics. Third, get to know the other members. By logging in, you can see all of their profiles, and we are glad to make any introductions, if wished. Fourth, if you are wrestling with any key issues or decisions, we strongly encourage you to reach out to the other members. Also, our site makes it very easy to post questions. The seniority and experience of your fellow members makes this the best possible forum to get advice from others who have probably dealt with the same issues and can give you sound advice on what worked and what did not. Fifth, we really encourage site visits. If you have not visited others' offices to have a great discussion on best practices and see their facilities, please do so. You can log in to see the other members' companies and cities, so feel free to reach out, or as mentioned, we are happy to make introductions. Sixth, we also generate executive summaries of meetings, including the key takeaways and learning nuggets, so that you can reference them and put them right into action. Seventh, our members are very busy, so we started a service where we pick out the top 6 most interesting articles among thousands at hundreds of sites to keep you abreast and ensure you don't miss the key ones. Lastly is our Book of the Month summary that you can either read or listen to as you commute. Each month we will be selecting the most interesting book, then summarizing the ideas so within minutes you can absorb the key takeaways. There are many other benefits, of course, but I just wanted to highlight some and keep a lookout in your inbox for a number of these each month. That takes care of the housekeeping items. If you'll just give me a few moments to now pull up the speaker's presentation and introduce her. Okay, all set. Now, before I turn the call over, I would like to tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Katherine is a principal at KPMG Strategy with over 20 years of experience in marketing as both a consultant and practitioner, focused in the retail and consumer sectors. She specializes in using insights to drive transformational growth strategies across a range of topics such as customer strategy, localized assortment, personalized communications, loyalty strategies, pricing, and promotions. She has led major engagements with retail clients in North America, the UK, and Ireland. Katherine, thank you so much for being with us today. Just say next when you wish the slides to advance, and the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. And I guess you can go ahead and advance. We'll do our first next. Perfect. And no need to spend too much time here. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm excited to be with this group today. My whole career pretty much has been spent with marketers and in marketing as a practitioner, split between financial services and retail. I spend most of my time in retail today, so a lot of the examples that we're going to go through happen to be retail, but I think you're going to find them applicable to most B2C businesses. And of course, most trends in B2C tend to have an impact in B2B as well. So if you're not in the retail space, hopefully we'll still have something of value, and definitely feel free to ask some questions on how this may or may not relate to your industry, or make a comment in our Q&A section. I think sometimes it's easiest to learn from other members as much as a speaker, so we'll welcome that. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the content. Next slide, please. Perfect. So really today you may be wondering what is this sort of people on the move or digital disruption 2.0, and really what we're seeing is, no surprise, we're in the midst of a very large shift in how people are spending their time and also how they move. And as this chart illustrates, we've already seen a pretty substantial dip in how consumers travel, how often and how far they travel to consume goods. And no surprise, and run errands, no surprise that's driven in large part by online shopping. But we've already seen about a 13% drop in annual trips per person for things like buying goods and running errands. And while we are traveling a little bit further for things like work and for social events, or excuse me, not social events, for transporting others, largely related to healthcare and school and religion, we're driving a lot less frequently for shopping and errands. And this is expected to continue. Our projections are that we will see anywhere between a 30 and a 50% decrease in personal miles driven between now and 2040. So we're really on the cusp of this trend, and it has a lot of implications. Next slide. As you'll see here, I think the implications on retail are really obvious. You hear about this in the news quite a bit. Stores closing, malls closing. Generally, the forecasts are that will continue for a number of years to come. But anytime we see a big change in behavior along these lines, the impacts typically aren't just to one industry. And there is a halo that goes along with that. If you stop making the trip for one thing, you're not going to make the other side trips you would have made along the way. So really, as we'll see on the next slide, slide 5, we expect those impacts to really hit a lot of industries, whether it's entertainment. We see that going into the home fairly substantially. Big impacts on transportation. Not only are we seeing people travel less, because they don't have to travel to have freedom, there's a growing trend among younger consumers to not really want to drive the same way, certainly, that I did when I was 16 and I wanted to get out of the house. It's not as necessary, and there's certainly some early research that suggests that younger consumers, early teens, just don't have the level of interest that people once did in driving and moving on. They're happy to take a rideshare service. They are getting out of the house, but not in the same ways that we once did. That obviously has a big impact on industries like oil and gas, on the automotive industry, and on packaging. I think we're probably all familiar with the rise in packaging that's occurring, because we are still seeing, while personal miles are decreasing and expected to decrease, total miles driven we expect to increase fairly substantially, and that's really driven by delivery trucks, and the implications to how they have to travel to deliver goods. Okay, next slide. The real issue that we see from marketers in that equation is when people stop traveling to stores, to restaurants, although we're not seeing that one quite as much yet, to entertainment facilities, whatever the industry may be, typically folks will turn to marketing and say, hey, marketing, gosh, we have a problem. Traffic is not coming into our store, our business, the way it once did. We've got a traffic problem. And the issue there is, so often, and we'll talk in a moment about a typical reaction to that in retail and what happens, but fundamentally there are also business model changes underway. When you're competing with an online player, which is causing a lot of this change in behavior, it's not just that they're delivering to a door. They also have a fundamentally different business model. They're acquiring customers in a different way. They're mining that data in a different way, and they have a much more flexible infrastructure and cost structure to deal with. So you're not just competing with a change in consumer behavior. You're also competing with a competitive set that has a completely different infrastructure to it. Next slide. And that oftentimes leads to what we'll call a kind of a common doom loop. And if you look at that, it kind of starts with declining foot traffic. So let's say all those folks stop traveling as often, your traffic is declining. Frequently what we see is businesses turn to marketing and say, hey, we've got to bring more traffic in. Let's run another promotion, another coupon, another discount. If you're in financial services, that may look like more balance transfers, more teaser rates, so whatever is appropriate for your industry, more discounting to bring traffic in. The problem with that is it reduces margins, and so the business then starts to cut expenses, either in the infrastructure or operating expenses, which oftentimes leads to a weaker value proposition for customers, which of course doesn't help the traffic situation and oftentimes feeds more traffic decline. So a bit of a conundrum. When people stop traveling, it has lots of impacts to a lot of consumer businesses, and oftentimes marketing kind of gets stuck in this wheel because folks are expecting you to fix a long-term problem with a short-term solution. The good news, and we'll flip to the next slide. The good news is that marketers can really play a key role in not getting caught in that doom loop and kind of getting it right, the right balance. And we're really seeing three things that can make a big difference. The first thing is making sure you're worth the time, the money, and the time. Folks are really good at understanding if their price position and if they're worth a consumer's money. But what we hear consumers saying now more than ever before is this worth my time as well? And that's new territory for a lot of folks, and we'll dive into that one in a moment. The second thing is to dig deeper to understand exactly where your customer base is at, and I'll show you some examples for that. And the third is really creating a full picture. I know when I worked in a marketing department, I was extremely customer-focused and top-line focused. And what we're seeing now is more of a call for marketers to also be profit-focused and bring that into the equation. Not to become only profit-focused, but certainly to have purview on the full equation, the full picture. And we'll talk about some examples there. The next slide, we'll talk about being worth the time and the money. In this case study, you'll see this was an example where we were working with a specialty retailer that, frankly, wasn't worth the time and wasn't worth the money and was pretty inefficient in their operation. And that spelled a really bad scenario. And understanding kind of where you sit on those dimensions is really important. In this particular example, their consumers were moving online to buy goods. Share was moving very much online. The vast majority of it was moving online. What we saw when we looked at how consumers traveled to their stores relative to other stores is we saw there's always been a lot of cross-shop with some other shops like Walmart and big box retailers, but that was growing. And really because those players were introducing more of this particular product line, and it was causing consumers just to shift their trip. It was no longer worth making an extra trip to a specialty retailer when they could just get it at their big box. As a result, they were also not positioned well from a pricing standpoint. They had a higher quality product, but their price architecture skewed very high as a result, and consumers weren't really valuing that as much. And their loyalty program was considered really important, but it didn't really incent enough of the right behaviors in consumers. And then finally, to combat that, they were running promotional programs that were buy one, get one, that were not very efficient because they were pulling forward a lot of full price revenue, hurting their margins, and they had a high degree of store overlap or cannibalization, so not efficient. We'll flip to the next slide. Perhaps that example resonates with you, or perhaps certain elements of it do or don't resonate. But you may be asking yourself, well, okay, how do I get in front of that? How do I make sure I don't get into that position? How do I make sure my brand is worth the time and the money? There are two tools that we're working with clients on at the moment that are sort of newer data elements to introduce into the marketing equation. The first one is what I'll describe as customer-level time and money analysis. So understanding, particularly if you're a physical-based, and as I say, I do retail, so we work with a lot of clients who have physical store locations. So understanding for all of your customers, what is your time and value equation for that consumer relative to their other choices in the market. So if you were to think about your local store, pick a store, and all the other options for buying the products that you buy at that store. Is it really convenient for you? And are you getting a good value? And how are the trade-offs with other things? Of course, those aren't the only two things consumers make decisions on. There are other factors like experience and whatnot, but it's important to understand how those things stack up. And we build this from a customer level and then aggregate it up to understand what that looks like at a store and a region and a chain level. But that's really critical because what we see in our research over and over again is oftentimes consumers don't shop at their favorite store, which may sound crazy, but when you dig into why, it's particularly if it's something that's a sort of a routine, less discretionary purchase, like groceries, for example. And the reason typically has to do with location and sometimes price. It's almost always either a location or a price thing. If someone's shopping you, you're not their favorite store, and it's a routine purchase, high frequency type trip, price and location are almost always the drivers, occasionally assortment, but usually one of those two things. So it's important to get a grip on this to understand your core sales. And the other thing that we're starting to look at more and more often is on the right-hand side of this particular slide is what we'll call a new level of journey mapping. So not just how they interact with your brand, but where were they before and where were they after, particularly from a physical location standpoint. This very busy graph represents a particular retail brand and where people were before and after shopping at this particular store. And in this instance, if you read it, we purposely make these kind of hard to read because it's anonymized client data. But in this particular example, folks were at restaurants beforehand, and you'll even see in the blue, it has to do with restaurants and dining. The orange is hotels. So this is a retail store where predominantly before and after shopping at it, customers are either having a meal or a drink or they're leaving their hotel. So they have a big tourist volume and it's sort of a leisure-oriented consumer base, which frankly for this particular retailer was a big surprise. They thought they were actually capturing mostly from the local neighborhood. In this instance, we did a lot of other forms of analysis to show that was partially true, but just not entirely. And that's important to understand as well because if you are running a physical location-based business, and particularly if you're not the main event for a trip, it's important that you're co-located next to things that consumers are still going to drive to. So when consumer miles drop off, and we see this over and over again, that consumers still drive to shop in pretty much any category, but they're driving less. And so if you tend to be their number 2 or 3 or 4 stop in a particular shopping trip, you're at big risk for just falling off the agenda, particularly as we saw in our last case study when other options that are further up on their to-do list can suddenly replace your offering. So we are in talks with a lot of retailers in particular, but as I say, physical location businesses about how they think about when their store leases expire, how they think about new locations related to this data and what's appropriate for their brand, particular restaurants, particular service locations that can bolster traffic and help retain traffic to their stores. Hopefully they're doing that in and of themselves by having a great, strong brand and being worth the time and money, but having a little halo from another brand that's attracting traffic into an area doesn't hurt. And we see that a lot. We see certainly smaller niche players sometimes perform better. Actually, I know one client in particular performed much better when they were in the same parking lot as a Walmart than they did when a store was a mile away from a Walmart. And the reason was they were able to pick up halo off of the Walmart traffic when you didn't have to get in your car and drive to a new parking lot. But if you had to do that, it fell off. And they weren't strong enough. They didn't have a strong enough value proposition to become the number 1 trip on the list. And it was a niche player, so that makes sense. And so therefore they were losing out on a lot of traffic. Okay, next slide. To give an example on digging deeper, which is the second thing that we talked about, that would be interesting to look at an example from online shopping. And this happens to do with grocery. Grocery, of course, there's a lot in the press about it these days, and it's not as far advanced in migrating online as some other categories, but it's getting there. And what we see in grocery, which I think mirrors what we've seen in other categories as well, is that there's still a level of variation in how much consumers are shopping online. Sorry, my screen just went blank, but I think it was my computer. Okay, sorry, apologies. What we're finding is in online grocery, the vast majority of folks still drive to a store, but more and more consumers are starting to do more of their shopping online. And we did a segmentation in a recent study sponsored by KPMG on online grocery shopping to look at that pattern. What proportion of their shop were they currently doing online for groceries, and how much should they anticipate doing in the future? And on the left-hand side of this page are the folks who are doing the most shopping online and planning to do even more in the future. And that's still not even, frankly, the majority. You'll see there the cutoff is greater than 40% of shopping online is the most saturated online. The next group being 20 to 40% of their shopping online and increasing, and so on. What was interesting about this is almost all, I think it was 85% of folks in that online pioneer category were under the age of 35. It's probably not so surprising, but I'm a big online grocery shopper. I was surprised it was maybe 85% versus maybe 60 or 65%. What's also interesting is folks who do no grocery shopping online or almost no shopping online and don't plan to increase, 80% of those folks are over the age of 35. So we do see a big age break in this trend, and that tells me that this trend is only going to grow over time. I actually, prior to seeing this research, wasn't necessarily convinced of that because online groceries have been around in Europe and other countries for decades, and the adoption was still relatively low. So I think what we're seeing in the U.S. may be quite different because our consumers are being introduced to this in a time where a large portion of our consumer base and certainly a young portion of our consumer base have been exposed to digital and online shopping and other categories for large portions of their life. And so I think the acceleration of grocery shopping online in the U.S. may be more advanced. Next slide. Now, whether you're in grocery or something completely different, and more than likely something completely different, I think the main takeaway for you and why this will be important is no matter what your industry, you're probably thinking, gosh, we've got to be online, we've got to be digital, we've got to win with digital, and you do. But the rate at which you win with digital and how you do it and what it means for your stores may be quite different depending on your consumer base. And this chart shows some particular grocery retailers, hopefully you'll recognize some from your own backyard, and the proportion of shoppers that they have in each of those segments that we looked at before. So, for instance, the folks on the left-hand side, Albertsons and Walmart, have a much larger proportion of online pioneers than the folks on the right-hand side, Wegmans and Giant Food. And that's not all bad. Certainly Wegmans is performing very well. Their consumers are trained to go in store. They have a large convenience offering. They have a large fresh offering. They are doing a great job of continuing to drive consumers to their store. But they also have to be on the lookout because certainly as the population changes and adapts more to online grocery, they could be missing out on large portions of the shopping trip and the basket if they don't start to adapt to this. So it's not to say that all the folks on the right can ignore digital and the folks on the left need to, continue to ramp it up. It is just to say that they can vary their pace and make smart investments. And if I were working with Wegmans, I would certainly suggest to them, gosh, I wouldn't short your current in-store experience for the sake of going digital. You've got to continue to nurture your current value proposition and your current customer, but of course you can't ignore the future either. So it's all about knowing your consumer in depth, knowing where they sit on this equation so that you can invest appropriately in technologies and move at the right pace for your value proposition and customer base. Next slide, please. And then our final point was on profitability. And this is an example of a promotions analysis that we're frequently doing for companies that tends to shine a light on things like promotions. There's nothing wrong with a good promotion or a balance transfer or a big sale. Those are all great things as long as we know what we're doing. And so often we'll walk into a retailer, and they're guilty of saying, hey, this promotion was fantastic because it drove in tons of traffic this day, but they can't necessarily unpick what happened the next few weeks because of that promotion, or how much of that promotion, how profitable the promotion was because of vendor funding, or how much halo it drove into the store beyond a particular product that was on sale, et cetera. So our urging to marketers is to get much more robust data on the profitability of what's going on around their promotions and around couponing, not just in the first few weeks of the sale, but the longer term impacts and how that impacted not just the weekly traffic, but the longer term 4, 8, 16-week total financial view of what happened with the consumer. Probably never move away from promotions or couponing entirely, but maybe there's a way to adjust some factors within that. And that's typically what we see here is the best outcome if this is not profitable is to tweak either vendor funding or the promotion amount or how promotions are co-located or co-promoted with other products. The timing of them to get a better result than it is to completely stop or completely accelerate the promotion. Generally, it's understanding the financial levers underneath it to get to the best outcome. Similarly, if you think about something like returns, which is a big issue in the apparel retail space, being able to factor that in so you know that when you put a big sale out there, a big coupon out there, you're factoring in the net impact of returns into the equation is really helpful for understanding if that really was a profitable promotion that you ran or if there needs to be a different equation. Next slide. So all of that is well and good, but this is really hard stuff to pull out for a few reasons. One being war on talent, but also this takes a good amount of collaboration and effort across the entire organization. And all too often, I'll walk into a client and folks might be pointing fingers saying, oh, this is a marketing problem or a merchandising problem or whatever problem. And really, it's a total business problem that has to be solved cross-functionally in order to find the most profitable way through for folks. And folks have to be courageous to take a longer view. So often we find it really difficult to get out of that doom loop because it is difficult in the short term. And coupons do drive traffic in the short term, as do promotions, all those things that can lead to increased short-term traffic, but maybe longer-term profit and customer erosion. So figuring out and getting on the same page with the rest of your team on how to manage that can be a really tricky thing. And of course, advanced analytics helps in making the smart decisions and figuring out how to take a nuanced approach to some of these issues, but also getting your colleagues on board and singing off the same hymn sheet and taking a longer-term view is, in many cases, the most difficult part of this equation. So we'll leave you with that just to say that it's an interesting time, and we expect it to continue. Lots of things that marketers can do to be innovative and creative and take a new view on the world and a more empowered role, but it's not easy, and there's a lot that goes into that. And I guess with that, I'd love to hear any questions that have come up or ideas from folks as it relates to other industries or thoughts that you may have.
Thank you, Katherine. We really enjoyed your presentation. Before I go out and check the chat line of questions submitted, do we have any live questions? Again, it is *6 to unmute your line and go ahead with your questions, or a reminder that you can also click anywhere on this last slide, then you will see how to make a comment so you can type your question if wished. So again, any live questions? Okay, Katherine, we have received several questions throughout your presentation. Keep in mind, you may have touched on these, but I'll ask them all anyway, just in case there's something you would like to add to or elaborate on. Our first question, if consumers are moving online, wouldn't part of the solution be for a company to increase its online profile and meet them where they live?
Yes, great question. And absolutely, I think we would agree with that. As we talked about, and I'm sure some of this maybe is a timing issue, as we talked about later in the presentation, I think figuring out exactly the right timing for your customer base is really critical. The only reason being most folks don't have extra money to invest in online infrastructure, kind of too far ahead of the curve. So I would encourage you to understand what is the appropriate pace of online adoption, but absolutely, without a doubt, meeting consumers where they're at and your customer base where they're at is an important solution. Where we see folks kind of lagging behind on that, it's often because they either don't have the funding to do it, or it's just hard because there's a lot of legacy infrastructure. But absolutely, I think meeting consumers where they're at is critical to continuing to drive traffic.
Okay, thank you for that. Our next question, is it basically moving toward getting an app for the company, even if you don't think customers are demanding one? Yeah,
I would say again, I think you've got to balance out the investment and what's the right timing on that. I would say too that really to the prior question, you may be thinking, well, geez, you talked a lot about physical location, and so let's just migrate the whole thing online. The bottom line is for most physical businesses, the vast majority, 85% or more of their business is still happening in physical locations. And what we see, even for businesses and retailers who do this really well and they invest ahead of the curve and they do get great adoption, it just takes a long time for the digital adoption to catch up with the physical store. And the two work kind of hand in hand. It's actually a great advantage in some way to have the physical location. So it's not as simple as, drop the one and pick up the other. You've kind of got to run two ships at once, and oftentimes the underlying infrastructure doesn't match, and the skill sets and the thinking don't match. And so it's quite easy to say, okay, we'll start this digital thing and we'll get that going and we'll go more digital. It's quite a more difficult thing to actually make that happen at the same time, to continue to invest in things like the value proposition in a physical location while building a digital location with a completely different mentality and getting consumers attracted to that.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, does event planning play into the solution at all?
This is where I really wish this was interactive so I can clarify, but I'm going to assume event planning meaning like special events and sort of creating a more interesting in-store, physical store location. I mean, I think that's a great solution if that's what consumers want from your brand. If they're looking for excitement or entertainment or that's part of your brand experience, I think that can be a fantastic solution. And I do think consumers are looking for new and different ways, and they're attracted to that. And we do see that again and again when folks do introduce something new into a physical experience, that consumers are drawn to that. So I absolutely do think that can be part of the equation.
Okay, thank you. Now, our last question. Isn't the halo effect the premise behind malls? But malls have been having problems as well. So what makes non-mall halos perform?
Yeah, interesting. Restaurants. No, our restaurants are more convenient parking is the short answer for that. No, I do think that's exactly right. The malls absolutely have that premise of halo. You sort of go, you park one place, you can stroll around and see things. I think what's interesting is so much of the mall business has advanced online so much more rapidly that they're seeing that impact. What we are seeing is, particularly in shopping centers, this starting to come into play, much like in the mall business, more rapidly. And I do think actually QSR and restaurant and big box is still a big piece of that. And things that consumers haven't migrated online is a great place. Stay with the categories that are staying in store. if you are managing a physical location. So if you're co-located to a grocery store that has a huge fresh offering or convenience-based offering, a lot of QSR, we still see a lot of good traffic patterns into pharmacy. That sort of thing is still going to attract footfall in a way that the mall just isn't attracting anymore. But you're spot on. That was the premise, and it's unfortunately not really working in that concept in the same way, but there are still examples where it does work.
All right, Katherine, I think we have covered everyone's questions. Do you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom you would like to share before we end our summit today?
No, I'd just like to thank everyone for the active participation. Obviously, as you all have alluded, there are complexities to how consumers move and models that have worked in the past that no longer work going forward, and lots of ideas and solutions out there that I'm sure this group is discussing. Would encourage you to continue to advance those and innovate in the space. And thank you very much for your time.
Katherine, simply wonderful thoughts. On behalf of all of the executives on the line, I would like to thank you for sharing such powerful ideas and key thoughts with us today. Your involvement and dedication to our profession sets a high benchmark for others to follow. For all of the participants on today's call, thank you for your continued membership and insightful questions for today's speaker. The meeting is now officially concluded. Katherine, thank you so much again, and everyone have a great day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.